Hey guys, Coach Berto here. As many of you guys know, 2017 was a contest prep year for me. However, what a lot of you guys don't know is that this is something that I set myself up for somewhere in the middle of 2016. So what I'm here to tell you guys is that if you're planning on competing in 2018 and you're planning on using Team 3DMJ as your coaching service, that you better get a hold of us now. This is to ensure that you are in the right position to maximize your prep, both in regards to the effectiveness of the prep, so that we can not just be effective, but also educate along the way, and so that we can have fun. So don't be one of those people who get a hold of us in January and it's a situation that we just have to turn down. The time is now, folks. You will not regret it. You will be glad that you thought of this and set yourself up for success ahead of time.
Hi 3DMJers, this is Andrea Valdez, and today I'm talking to Brad Loomis and Eric Helms about exercise selection and modification. As people who live the bodybuilding or powerlifting lifestyle, we can often become frustrated, confused, and often judgmental when we see people in the gym doing exercises that we deem inappropriate for whatever reason, right? Maybe their squat is too high, their range of motion is too small, their form is funny looking, or they're doing some other randomly absurd exercise that we feel is irrelevant or unnecessary to get big and strong. And then we think to ourselves, like, why the hell are they doing that? Is it actually wrong? And then if they look good, like, should we be doing that? Is there an actual benefit from performing this weird thing in such a way? So, as you can probably guess, the real answer, as usual on our podcast, is it depends. So today's episode talks about when and why it may actually be fully appropriate and even intelligent to use things like half reps, pause reps, tempo training, bands and chains, overloaded walkouts, isometrics, form modifications, and all those other things that are not considered normal within a standard powerlifting or bodybuilding environment. We also talk about how to train out of sticking points, how to work around injuries, and how to test whether your plateaus are global programming issues or simply exercise-specific problems. So as usual, if you have any feedback or comments on this one, head to 3dmusclejourney.com and leave it for us under podcast number 65. Or you can actually leave it as a comment on a YouTube video because people seem to like doing that. So, but before we dive in, I wanted to let everyone know that just a couple of days ago, we released a brand new free course to the 3DMJ Vault called Gaining Strength While Cutting. So if you would like access to this and all of our other courses, go to 3dmjvault.com and enroll for free. Again, that's 3dmjvault.com. So let's get into it. Here's my conversation with Eric Helms and Brad Loomis called Exercise Selection and Modification. Hope you like it. I should have asked my athlete before doing this, but I'm going to go ahead and say where this kind of came from. So what, and I've been there a bajillion times, but she was like, I go to this gym and I'm the only one that competes in anything. It's very, there's personal trainers, but it's not very, there's no really athletes, things like that. And she goes, and they just all do half squats. And all of them, and with their trainers, and it's only halfway down, and it's really bad, and they wear bad shoes. Then she was like, am I crazy? Should I be upset? It just really ruffles my feathers. I mean, is it ever okay to do half squats and this and that? And I was like, I've been upset before watching people do stuff at gyms, but I think it depends on the intention of why you're doing things that are not typically considered normal exercises. Correct, Eric? Or I guess how...
Wow, impressive.
I think that is 100% correct.
Yeah.
And there's actually even some studies showing that quarter and half squats might be better for sprint performance than full squats.
Right. And it reminded me exactly of something that you gave us. One of your recent R&D updates. I don't know what the exact context was, but I remember us talking about half squats for, was it sprint performance? Was it a different sport? What was it?
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure there's a fairly robust amount of literature showing that quarter and half squats might be better for sprint performance. And it really just comes down to specificity instead of thinking of squats as good if they're full range of motion because, hashtag ATG, hashtag we're powerlifters, hashtag with the weightlifting, hashtag hardcore is thinking of, this is a specific way to develop force production and what is it going to transfer the most to? What joint angles am I trying to strengthen? What muscles are associated with those movements at those joint angles, etc. So I'm not an expert at all in sprint performance. This would be a better question for like Brett Contreras or something like that. But I am just aware that, for one, half squats make you stronger at half squats better than full squats, and full squats make you better at full squats than half squats, and half squats seem to be better for some markers of performance.
Yeah, and the other kind of caveat I gave her too, I was like, well, if there are a lot of people in this world who can't appropriately get to the bottom of a squat without any weight, therefore forcing them down with weight would probably be not so safe. So like if my 60-year-old great aunt decided she wanted to start going to the gym and we loaded her with quarter and half squats, that would be better than having her go all the way down on hips that don't open or knees that don't get that, or in ankles that don't get that degree of flexion, stuff like that, right?
Oh, 100% agree. I mean, something I've been saying for a very long time is, and because I've seen people get hurt and I've seen trainers hurt people, is that you should be training the range of motion you have or loading the range of motion you have. And then if you have a range of motion deficit that we really think is related to, strength, proprioception, or just a lack of mobility and flexibility, it's not something structural, then you should be just working on increasing your mobility, which, comes as a natural consequence of many other fitness types. But yeah, you don't want to have someone train with a quote unquote full range of motion if they have to do some jacked up stuff to get to that full range.
Yeah, I feel bad because
and Eric, here's a quick question for you. Because I get a question quite a bit where people are like, well, you know what, I can, like a good example is incline presses. I don't know why bodybuilders feel that they have to have incline presses as part of their program, but like they'll train with a nice full range of motion with like say 115 pounds, but as soon as they go to 150 or 175, something like that, I can't go to a full range of motion because I have pain. And so I have to do partial reps with the heavier weight. And to me, something doesn't add up there. It's like, well, can you just not do the appropriate range of motion because it's too heavy? Or do you truly have some sort of an injury that shows up when you use heavier weight and use that full range of motion? It doesn't add up to me.
Yeah, that to me that's an indicator of something. If you can do something, if load changes the amount of pain, there's probably an underlying issue there. Obviously there is a certain point where that could just happen just from load. Like if you truly are reaching and ranges of tissue stress, but that isn't something that should be a thing for people. Like the human body can move a lot of weight, and when you're moving from 115 to 160 pounds on an incline bench press, and all of a sudden you have pain, and to avoid it, you have to do a different range or a partial range of motion. It probably just means you're not incline benching correctly, or there is an underlying issue. So, and I see a lot of bodybuilders don't really know how to incline press. Like, actually, I see a lot of powerlifters who don't know how to incline press. They try to tuck more and touch too low, and they don't really let themselves kind of flare a little more naturally. So, yeah, I think that may just be because they have a little too much experience benching, and they're trying to translate that to an incline. It's a different movement. But yeah, it's a general philosophy. If you can do a range of motion with some load and then too much load, it causes pain. Either there's an underlying issue that you need to be addressed, or your form needs to be modified, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Because I do remember a long time ago, back in my personal trainer days, I had a guy that he could not use a full range of motion on his incline presses. So we just used partial incline motion. We just progressed in a normal fashion. And, he got pretty strong at it, was safe, actually did get a little bit of chest development. And To me, that all made sense. He could not get a full range of motion pain-free with an unloaded bar, and it was the same as if we had 130 pounds on there. You know what I mean? So we just always trained with a partial range of motion, and he actually got pretty decent gains with the Z from it.
Best kinds of gains to get.
With the Z. But I think that's really common, right? And I know that I had that mindset too, of if it's not absolutely fully correct, you shouldn't even do the exercise at all, or you're, I think it's hard to not be very elitist about it when you care so much about what you're doing, but
it's funny because all of the form is arbitrary,
Yeah.
To some degree, not completely. Obviously, we do things that make sense from a biomechanical perspective, but if you're not in the gym and you're in just walking around doing daily life, nobody's going to critique you for how you pick up groceries or sit down in a chair or move. We're always producing force, and sometimes there's load. Yet, for some reason, if you do anything that involves hip extension and you're vertically loaded in the gym, you have to keep a neutral spine. You can't have an asymmetrical stance. Your feet have to be turned out at the same amount, et cetera, et cetera. And that's and taken too far, that can, I think Dean Somerset's great at talking about this, just how you can have different hip structures left to right. So you may need to have, or an injury history, where you actually, a better stance for your biological structure is having, one foot at 15 degrees and the other one at 25 degrees external rotation. Or one foot slightly forward, slightly back, or maybe you need a heel lift on one side. We're not built perfectly symmetrical left to right, so our movements probably shouldn't be. And if you are having enough awareness to feel it just feels better when I turn my left foot out more when I squat, then that's probably a better stance than trying to force them both straight or the same amount. And not that it's something that I think applies really well to bodybuilding or powerlifting, but there's some interesting concepts out there in different kind of schools of training where they, use multi-planar, multi-directional kind of lunge stuff and the whole quote unquote 3D training that you see at fitness conferences. But I think it makes sense for activities of daily life and for sports performance where you're, training in multi-planes and produce force and react to an opponent. Yeah, you probably want to get outside of your kind of sagittal dominant resistance training for the most part. And sometimes it's going to look like exercises that aren't the big 3 or 6 or whatever you're paying attention to.
Yeah, go ahead, Brad.
Well, I was just going to say, it's interesting that you mentioned that because I think about my son's coach, his speed coach, and the stuff that he has him do. And as you're talking, it kind of it makes sense now, the things that she's having him do with the multi-directional loaded change of direction and high box spots and things like that, it just is kind of now it's now I understand,
I think anyone who hasn't played football in the last 5 years, so even if you were a high school football player, right, and say you're 25, 26 now and you've been bodybuilding this whole time, you go play a game of touch football and you'll be so sore in all, your ankles, your hips, your knees, but it's
neck.
Your neck, yeah, everything, right? And it's...
that was one thing I found. I played a Christmas game went back and played with some of my old buddies in 2000, God, it must have been either 2007, 8, or 9, maybe 10. But it was funny because I was a terrible football player in high school, but I became friends with a lot of the guys, and they were like, hey, let's play. And no diss to any of them, but most of them were not in the same kind of shape they were in high school, but I was in much better shape. So I was running the ball, which never happened back when I was in high school, and getting cracked hard by people who would have laid me out in high school, and they're not laying me out. But then the next day I was like, why is my neck so sore? And it's because I've never had people hanging off my head while I'm trying to keep a straight neck, and I just realized how much my neck development is. I don't train that, and there's actually this is totally off topic, but I just think it's kind of cool. Ahead. There's some studies out there. I think I saw Chris Beersley post about this. There's a study where people were doing Olympic lifting movements, powerlifting movements, overhead presses, and variants of that. And another group that did that, but on top of it, that actually isolated like neck extension flexion and lateral flexion. And the group doing all of the compound barbell work that you'd think would develop the neck didn't have any increase in neck hypertrophy at all. But the group that just added 3 times a week of neck flexion extension and lateral flexion grew like a substantial amount in 12 weeks.
Huh.
And it just goes to show you it's like specificity.
Yeah, like now I know it looks freaking insane, but I'm trying to do like 30 handstand push-ups within like 30 seconds is like a goal of mine. And every time I post about it, someone's like, "Oh my God, you're gonna have a concussion." I'm like, "No, it doesn't hurt at all." It's just, but I remember the first day, and again, I grew up as a gymnast. I used to do that shit all the time. But a couple years ago when I first got assigned to like, let's try a few very slow handstand or headstand to like push out to your feet kind of thing. And my neck was so damn sore. I mean, and I'm probably held a headstand for a total of like 3 minutes day one. And now again, like I can just bounce off of it. It's like no big deal. But it'd be like my neck on that. I think the first day I did jump rope, not even double unders. Before I could do double unders, just regular jump roping for the first day. My calves were sore. A couple years ago, I played basketball at a gym, and I'd been powerlifting, bodybuilding, and my ankles and like the sides of my glutes, like my hips were so sore because I never go lateral. I never push outward ever. I was like, shit, man. And I have a lot of powerlifting friends that if I told them jog around the block, I'd be a little bit worried.
Most definitely.
It's like, it's strange, right? The way we adapt, but I don't know. Anyways, okay. Go ahead, Eric.
But to bring it back home, like there's there are reasons to do things outside of their typical bounds. I think we've only just briefly touched on a piece of it, which is like range of motion. And, I think that's an easy one to me. It's like train the range of motion you have, unless you actually have a sport that requires a certain range of motion, like powerlifting, then obviously you need to do everything you can to work on getting that range. But there's a ton of other stuff out there, like training partial reps or focusing on certain ranges of motion in the powerlifting community, like board presses or deficit deadlifts, increasing the range of motion, or a partial deadlift, like a rack pull, or pause squats. Like there's rationale for all these things, and I think. How
about tempo training, Eric? I see a lot about tempo training, and I've never really used that before.
It's interesting. I mean, I went on a little mini war against tempo training because it was done for reasons that didn't make sense, like trying to enhance time under tension to therefore get a better, hypertrophy response. And that doesn't really make sense just because then you're forced to do less load or reps, and the total work performed, even though the time under tension might be higher, might be less because the actual force output's lower. And to like slow motion, slower moving lifts from a muscular tension perspective are only going to put strain on a fiber when the motion slows because it's heavy or because you've created fatigue, or you're just controlling the tempo. So that's not necessarily going to do that. However, from a learning perspective, if you're actually just trying to get down motor learning, moving through something quickly that is a complex movement, or that you're still trying just to kind of learn, just slowing that down just allows you to have more time to make, motor connections and understand things. I mean, that's something that people have been doing for ages. You train something, a complex movement, slowly or in pieces before you train it as a whole. And I think that's very valid. Other reasons might be, I've seen some stuff on potentially maybe getting some tendinous adaptations if you're going moderately heavy and doing like tempo work or pauses. I could see an argument for that. Mike T plays around with that during his pivot blocks. Like he'll do like tempo to a metronome when he does bench, and does pause to the chest, and just trying to basically, I think, trying to get some tendinous adaptations. I'm not too familiar with that research. I think that's a very reasonable reason to do that. And it certainly is a way to make something harder. I just don't know if it is the best or most specific way to make something harder.
Stability training. Stability is that's something that I do it a lot for in my program. Like my shoulder health or whatever. Since then, we do a lot of like bamboo presses, like 5 seconds down, 5 seconds up, shit like that. So it's like unstable and slow. So I feel like a complete idiot, but it's important. But
I'm less convinced of the stability benefits.
okay.
I don't think there's much robust research on that because it's very different. I don't think that will transfer to making a free weight barbell more stable.
But wouldn't it transfer to my just like control?
Controlling a bamboo, yeah. But I would think doing something a little more specific would make more sense to me. It just depends on how stability training is done. Like, I ask people like, oh yeah, close your eyes. It makes it a lot harder to balance on one foot. And I'm like, that's nothing to do with, well, you're removing an entire sense, or standing on an unstable surface.
Well, if you're coming back from an ankle injury.
Certainly.
Yeah. Okay.
Is if that's the situation we're talking about, I can see some relevance for that. Basically what I'm getting at is there needs to be a specific rationale versus a random application of this stuff, which is, I think, unfortunately, I see a lot of people go, right, Shiko has pauses at the knee, so I'm going to do them. Or I know, Paul Carter recommends pause squats, so I'm going to do them. Or my NASM textbook says people are supposed to do something on an unstable surface, so I'm going to do that. And not really understanding deeper and thinking about it as a specific tool to fix a specific problem, which is, I think, the way less specific versions of the primary movements that you're trying to train should be instituted.
Right. Okay. So common argument or question, right? If I can do full back squats, maybe I'm not a power lifter, but say I'm a bodybuilder and I can do a full depth back squat, no problem. Why would I ever do pauses or tempo or half squats or box squats? Like, what are those reasons specifically? If I am healthy and can go all the way down, is there ever a point?
I like the example of a powerlifter a little better, a bodybuilder. I don't think it matters because you would just you're not trying to get better at squats. You're just using squats as a vehicle to grow. But a power lifter, I could definitely see an argument for using a pause squat or using a box squat potentially. Probably less so the box. I don't think there's a whole lot of times that makes sense. But for example, if you have a really tough time maintaining stability in the hole and coming out of it, the most direct way to train that would be a squat. But if that transition time is so short, it may not be the best way to go from A to B. If you can get more specific for that specific issue by doing a pause squat, then that might be a better pathway from point A to point B, addressing the portion of the lift where you have a specific technical issue, with a pause squat. I think that makes sense, and I've definitely given some people pauses who they tend to, they experience a little bit of a squish at the bottom, or they can't control the bounce out of the hole. The bounce tends to bring them forward, or their butt rises too quick. More squats it will eventually solve that problem, I think. But I don't know that it's the best way to get there. It's a lot of repetitions where they're having a split second to think about what they're doing coming out of the hole. But with a pause squat, you're descending slowly into it, pausing and thinking about it and coming out. And you know that you're actually trying to focus on the way you come out of the hole. Now, is it the same as you would do with a squat with a faster turnaround and an actual pronounced SSC, stretch shortening cycle, versus letting it dissipate? No. But if you can't control that SSC, then you might want to slow it down. I think the pause should get shorter over time. What I see people doing online is they'll start with 1 or 2 or 3 second pause. Next thing you know, they're doing breathing squats and they're sitting in the hole for 30 seconds and they're like, this is so hard. I'm like, yeah, it's hard, but that doesn't make any sense to me. If you're trying to train a motor pattern, then you do the pauses and you shorten the pause over time until you're getting the same effect and the same bar path that you're trying to get and you're trying to correct, not lengthen the pause until the movement feels completely foreign compared to a normal squat.
Okay, so what about the opposite query of my squat's fine, or my deadlift is fine. Let's say I'm a powerlifter, my deadlift is fine, but I really enjoy No, we'll stay with the squat because I like doing pause squats. I think it's fun. Is it necessarily worse? And I guess that's all in. So if I decide that of my squat volume for the week, for 15% of it, I'm going to do pauses instead of full normal squats. Is that actually bad or worse if I don't have a problem with my squat?
Maybe, maybe not. Depends on the person.
Yeah.
The way I would approach that is I just wouldn't displace the actual squat. Like, you're probably going to do some accessory work, like, so if someone's like, oh, I got lunges in here, I'm like, well, you can do pause squats instead of lunges if you want. Like, we don't necessarily need to have opportunity cost. Like, if we have your squats in there for a reason and you just want to do something for more variety's sake for fun, then we would take something of a lower priority to swap it out to have less of a potential negative.
Cool. Okay.
In my mind. It's just order operations, basically.
Yeah. And then that also brought up, well, why, in my brain, when you say we can replace it with lunges, and I'm like, well, I feel like being a unilateral movement.
Okay, leg press.
Okay.
Just a bad example. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, and Eric, another quick question for you. In my mind, if we're using something like tempo training, I would guess that would be, kind of more so controlling the eccentric portion of the movement as opposed to the concentric, because
you can do both.
Tempo training on the concentric, does that make sense? I mean,
I think it makes a little less sense but I could still see there being an argument and a time and place for it.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
I do like if I was going to institute, like, a lot of the times when I tell people to slow something down, a lot of times it is the eccentric, because the concentric on a movement that starts with an eccentric is going to be largely dictated by the position you start that concentric from.
Yeah.
Like,
correct.
when you hear people talking about missing my groove on bench, which you hear people say all the time, that often doesn't occur on the concentric. That occurs because they touch too low or too high on the concentric, which is not time well spent. Ideally, you would start from the right position and finish in the right position and not have to correct. And I think the eccentric has some nice physiological properties to it. You're stronger eccentrically. So even when you're handling, like, your 1RM, which is basically your concentric 1RM, you could probably do 3 or 4 reps with that, especially if you were trained. If just controlling the eccentric, like if then it just flew out of your hands back in the starting position. Like for example, I will occasionally do eccentric training on bench press, especially because there's a pause in the press command, and you have to get into position, and the position you get into is going to be dictated by that eccentric. So I have done as much as probably 110% of my 1RM for, like, a triple on eccentrics, just getting a big bro spot on the way up and then just focusing on getting the bar path where it needs to be on the way down. I think that makes a lot of sense. You'll be very well prepared for a long press command. You're less likely to misgroove a weight that's 15 kilos, 30 kilos less, and I think the same could be said for the squat. The deadlift probably makes a little less sense because it starts with the concentric.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
So
interesting.
The purpose, though, right, I know it stemmed from that conversation I had with my athlete, but it made me think more of, like, if we were to make some generalizations, that the normal person doesn't need to do any of this shit, right? I mean,
I would agree.
Yeah, but then it's the question of, if they want to, is it bad? Should they not include variety?
I think you have to approach it from the right end of the equation. I think a lot of people will see someone doing a variation of a lift and then try to figure out why they're doing it. In my mind, it's like, no. Go back to the start. Is there a specific issue you're trying to fix, not just variety for variety's sake, and not just trying to figure out why someone is doing something? And then what is probably the most logical solution to that, right? And because the ultra specificity arguments don't make sense either. If you go to the end, like, my grip strength sucks. With straps, I can deadlift 600 pounds. Without straps, I can deadlift 550. Well, just deadlift 550 a lot until your grip strength gets stronger, and then you'll be able to do 555, and that'll solve your grip strength problems. That's stupid. No, just take a bar out of a rack that's, more than your max and hold on to it for as long as you can. And within like 4 times as fast of a period, you'll eventually be able to deadlift more without deadlifting, without that being the solution. I've seen that work many, 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 many times, because it's specifically addressing the problem. And that's a good example because it's very obvious. I think other things are less obvious. When you have to make assumptions about what muscle groups are weak or what muscle groups are strong, then you start missing out on stuff. So the less assumptions you have to make, the more likely that specific accessory work is going to be successful. That assistance work is probably a better way to say it. Like, a classic one that people think makes a lot of sense, but might not actually be true is that, a front squat is more quad dominant, a low bar squat is more, glute and ham dominant. And man, I still have a tough time letting go of this, but, interestingly enough, like the hamstrings, because they are counteracting the quads in many ways, basically stay in a quasi-isometric state, shortening at the knee, lengthening at the hip in all squats, and act just as a way for your quads to transfer force and your glutes to transfer force to extend the hip and the knee. And basically, your quads are going to have to work similarly hard without much of a difference for most people on average in that position. Your mileage may vary. So it's not a reliable thing just to go, right, you got weak quads, we need to throw some front squats in there. Now, other things might be useful, like the harder rack position to hold from a front squat. Like you almost are always going to lose in this order, a squat because of back strength. Front squat's the hardest, high bar next, and then low bar is the least, because it's further down on your back. And yeah, people look at a low bar and think, oh, I'm more bent over, it's going to be more stress on my lower back, but probably not. And it may not be your lower back that's the issue. It's most likely your thoracic spine that's trying to keep the bar in the same position so you don't crunch forward and then get out of position and then miss. So I find front squats and high bar squats are very useful for people who need to keep a more upright upper back position in their competition squat, if that happens to be a low bar, for example.
Well, and I was just going to say, Andrea, I think to add on to your question that might even answer your question is that I have so many non-performance athletes. I call them cosmetic athletes, but people have a problem with that. So we'll just say physique athletes, right?
Okay.
Athletes that are non-performance related. You see it so much. It's like they see Fitspo hashtag Instagram, star doing this particular movement, which is, very odd. And they're like, oh, well, I want to try that. It's like that new shiny, toy that they've got there in the toy box. And they're like, oh, man, that's great. I really felt the burn in the glutes or the hams or the delts or whatever doing that movement, I don't know about you, Andrea, but if it's a physique athlete, I'll be like, well, okay, fine. We can go ahead and put those in a very low category type of an exercise if you really want to do that and it really jazzes you up and it really turns you on. But we're not replacing your overhead presses if it's a delt movement. We're not replacing your squats and your RDLs, and things like that if it's a glute movement. Sure, maybe we'll replace a hamstring curl, something like that. But I think to answer your question, in my mind, is it okay that we have some, I guess you could call it sport specificity? I think in that case, in my mind, I would be okay with that.
Yeah, I'll just have them swap it out.
I do that. Yeah, I do that a lot, to be honest with you, because with social media being so popular, yeah, when somebody sees, 90,000 follower, bikini WBFF pro doing Jeffersons with a barbell, and they love that because it makes the glutes burn. Yeah, sure. Go ahead. Let's replace it with a low category type of an exercise. So, Eric, what do you think about that?
The thing with Jeffersons, though, it's okay, is that's a high risk movement. There's a lot of people, and my chiro talks to him this all the time. Like, he goes like, oh my God. Like, it freaks, because what happened was Tim Ferriss had someone on his podcast that says everyone should Jefferson curl, and my chiro just like lost it. He was like, do you know how bad that is for most people and how unnecessary?
You mean Jefferson squat?
No,
Jefferson
curl. Is that what you just said?
I was talking about Jefferson squat.
Oh, okay.
It's like a split stance deadlift where the barbell's this way.
I thought you said when you
Kai
said
Green
Jeffersons,
made them super popular.
Okay, when you said Jeffersons, I was thinking Jefferson curl, and I'm like, I don't think anyone really needs to do that.
What's a Jefferson curl?
I don't know.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's like have a bar, you're standing on a box, and it's more of like a compression drill, and you're holding a barbell like you just deadlifted it, and you put that barbell as far down as you can, as close to your body as you can. You
So
pipe
you do like
all the way
a spinal
down.
flexion exercise.
Yeah. Really light too, but still.
Chinese weightlifters do that.
Yeah. And so gymnasts do it too, but my chiro and myself, like, we'll see that it's just a lot of people don't need to fold in half. Let's be for real. So yeah, that's what I thought you were talking about. That I was like, oh my God, what? But yeah, I think it's easier with accessories, right? Like you said, Brad, it's like if it's an accessory movement and you're like, whatever, I'll just say, like, if that's a glute ham thing, or switch it out with like something else that's not primary. So like usually between your 4th and 6th exercises of the day, but not like your first, okay? But it's I think where people get confused is like the pauses, the boxes, the half reps, the shit like that accumulates highly. Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, I just think for physique athletes, like, I wouldn't have any problem if someone wanted to do. Would I have a problem with someone who wanted to do, like, a spin machine split squat instead of a back squat as their primary leg movement? So long as they were stable, we could load it up. They could keep neutral spine. Like, okay, like, you're taking everything through. You're getting into, you're doing hip extension and knee extension and all that shit. So why not? So yeah, I think sometimes we put exercises too much on a pedestal for the pure physique athletes. But at the same time, you want something that you can objectively quantify and track progress on over time. And you also want something that you can probably do if you're someone who travels. So that's why I'm a big fan of, the basic barbell movements. That's going to be the same everywhere. If you get a squat rack, you can do a lot. So I think some of it's pragmatic, but sometimes we get a little too hung up. Like, no, your physique athlete does not need to deadlift. There's no real reason you can get that another way. If they want to, sure. If you think it's safe, et cetera, whatever. But you could do an RDL. You could do hip thrusts and back extensions. I mean, that's not as efficient. You got to do 2 movements, but there's a way to get there. So I think, when a bodybuilder tells me they're doing accessory movements, like, yeah, we all know what that means, but bodybuilders don't really have accessory movements. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, I guess that's a question of, like, wording. I mean, they do.
Right.
Are there isolations, or what do you want to call it?
That.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, but I mean, so what's the goal of a bodybuilder? Is to get proportionate development everywhere. So if the one thing holding back your physique is your biceps, then is a bicep curl any less important than a squat?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and then that Berto made some good points in our lagging body part post. It was a podcast where he was like, and would say that same example, right? Your weakest part is your biceps. He's like, well, then that should be your first work exercise every day. And I know a lot of people listening to this would freak out if they saw someone walk into the gym, do their curls, and then go do squats, because we are also ingrained to do the big ones first.
Yeah, and I think there's actually some research on that. I actually put that in our published paper on training, that exercises done first, typically more volume can be done with them. So it's not an unreasonable position to take of putting your weakest body parts first, or giving them their own day, or doing more volume, or et cetera, adding extra exercises. There's lots of ways to get around it. And you have to be smart about that. Like, you wouldn't want to do, oh, my hamstrings are weak, so I'm going to start my leg day with leg curls and then go to deadlifts. Like, that's a bad idea.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, like, you wouldn't, curls and squats makes a lot more sense than fatiguing one of the muscle groups that's going to be actively engaged in the compound movement you're going to do next that is a high-risk movement.
Yeah.
Yeah. But throwing in a little bit of arm work prior to your compound lifts on leg day, sure, definitely.
And another thing we get married to, too, right, when, as athletes in general, but with our physique athletes unnecessarily, is that it has to be the low rep heavies have to be in there. Because you told us about Luke a ton of times.
Yeah, Luke just doesn't like it. And I think we have pretty much only done 6+ rep range training. Like, his heavy stuff, 6 to 8,
Yeah.
So, and you could probably take it further than that. I think the only concern I have is that there may be a benefit to doing some heavy work. Where that line in the sand is what's considered heavy or not. That's up for debate. How much of it you need, that's up for debate. How much of a benefit you'll get training both heavy, light, and moderate, that's up for debate. But until I'm convinced that it can't have any harmful effect doing no heavy training, then I'm probably going to encourage most of my physique athletes to do at least some heavy work sometimes. And not that I necessarily care about them getting stronger. It's just that it might have a synergistic effect on hypertrophy long term, which is, like I said, still for debate, but it's certainly possible.
Yeah. Okay. What did we miss?
We can talk about bands and chains. Accommodating resistance, that's another one that people get pretty confused by.
Okay, talk to me about bands and chains, Eric.
So, that was such an organic transition. I just think I'm going to love it now.
Eric, do you need a drink of water? You've been talking like the whole time. Do you want to?
No, that's all.
You guys are asking me great questions.
Well,
that actually is something that I have used with quite a few clients, and I do have, some experience doing. I can't go into the science of it like Eric probably could, but
with bands and chains.
Yeah, with bands and chains, kind of. I mean, I guess both what you could call overload training and then, I guess just variable resistance. But it just kind of makes sense, if you have trouble, locking out on a deadlift. I've done chains many times, with folks who have trouble locking on a deadlift, just because the load gets heavier as you're lifting every, link of chain. If you have people that have trouble locking out on a bench press, throw some chains on there, throw some bands on there. That's always been very effective. But to me, it makes sense. It makes sense that you're using a tool to improve a specific portion, of the lift. I mean, me, myself, I love using overload squats. And I did that for a real long time where I put a band to the top of the cage to where it was super heavy at the top and it got lighter, at the bottom, and it helped me get out of the hole, and that just helped me get accustomed to heavier and heavier and heavier loads. Do I still do it? No, but I can sure squat a whole lot more because of it. And those heavy loads don't scare me like they used to. So it's just stuff like that just, it makes sense logically, when I've used that stuff in the past. So Eric, I think now if you've got your drink of water and your voice rested up, you can attend to all the
fill in all the gaps
on those.
Well, no, at first I wanted to say I think that's a very logical way to do things. You see a logical issue. This athlete really seems to have a slowdown of bar speed in the second half. Maybe we should try to specifically load that range of motion a little more instead of them being, limited by the quote-unquote weakest link in the chain. So I would use accommodating resistance. And, so I think that's the way to do it, is you see a logical problem and use a logical tool to try to solve it. It's always going to be a guess when you make these kind of decisions, no matter what way you take it. But sometimes it's better to guess than to do nothing at all and just stick with ultra specificity, which you're looking at going, this is not working. Or it's currently like, that's what we're doing, and I see a problem, so obviously that hasn't solved it. So the whole accommodating resistance thing, the reason it's called that for those who listen is because it accommodates the strength curve. So typically, if you think about where is the squat the hardest, it's harder deeper in the hole, and then it's easier when you get closer to lockout. The first, the period coming out of the hole, a few inches, and then a few inches past that is where most people typically stick. And then once you get past that, you're good, and you can make even a 1RM, like if you jam the lockout, move pretty fast. So accommodating resistance basically means that it does what it's already doing. Like it doesn't try to load the portion of the lift that's already harder. It makes it easier there and loads the part that's easier. So it's kind of making sure that you get a more constant training fatigue throughout the movement, that you can apply force more evenly throughout the curve. And there's actually a fair amount of research showing that it's not huge, just nothing to write home about, that adding this in actually seems to increase strength to slightly more than just doing the bare bones movement. But I don't think it should be just used willy-nilly, but I think being too anti-bands and chains doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Just realize that it is different than a squat. Anyone's ever walked out a squat with chains, like that's it starts swinging back and forth, and you've got like a rotational and anterior posterior stress now that you have to stabilize. And it's better to do that like out of a mono rack if you're not trying to get a stabilization challenge, if you want to have that, accommodating resistance. And bands don't feel normal, like it doesn't feel like a regular squat. So I think there's a lot to be figured out as, what is an appropriate amount of accommodating resistance to use, how often to use it, when should I use it, and I would say it should be a small part of your training further away from competition because it's less specific. So I think, yeah, it certainly makes sense if you're seeing some issues with range of motion. It even could make sense as just something you throw in as variations further away from competition that you do on one of your movement patterns per week. I think there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. It's not something I use heavily. It is something I have used, but it's not something that's in my regular toolbox for sure. But I keep it in there, and for all those reasons.
And something Brad said that makes me less scared. I think that's something too that we forget that the mental. I mean, I guess maybe a bench press too. Nah, but like squats, I get that they can be scary. And if there's like, I know some people just do heavy ass, just walkouts. I think,
I've had coaches do that a lot. Like, right, I never really understood why, but it seemed like it certainly helped. I would do heavy walkouts and heavy holds like 3 weeks out from a competition. So as we're tapering, I would hold on to a bench press that's 105 or 110% of my 1RM.
Yeah.
Or I would walk out a squat with that, and I don't know. I think it just more than anything is a mental thing myself. I mean, maybe Eric can attest to the physical part of it, but it just is less scary when you get underneath that weight and attempt a new 1RM, at a meet. And that's something that I've still use with a lot of my athletes, and it seems to help.
I mean, confidence is important, man.
Mm-hmm.
Very. I think that's the main reason you do something like a heavy walkout or a heavy hold is the confidence side of it. But it's also an insurance policy because you don't know what's going to happen when you get on the platform. You might have a judge who is very much a stickler with having your knees locked before you actually descend into the squat, and you're standing there for like 10, 15 seconds. You don't know why you're not getting the squat command, and they tell you to re-rack it, and the judge goes, hey, make sure your knees are locked. Then you have to lift it up again, walk back, and then squat.
Use all that energy, yeah.
I've seen that happen in competition. I saw it happen at Worlds. It's actually a little bit of drama, but you don't want to be in the position where that walkout with your 1RM twice and holding it for 20 seconds is the difference between making a lift and not. So that's kind of why I say it's used as an insurance policy. If you can hold, 5% more than your third attempt for 30 seconds, that shouldn't be a game ender for you. And I think that's a nice thing to have in your pocket.
Earlier you talked about the grip strength thing, right? How that's a pretty obvious fix. And you said what's less obvious is knowing which body parts are not, or I don't say body parts. Like,
which muscle groups?
Yeah, which muscle groups are the reason, or do you just guess? Seems like this is a problem for you. Let's train this for 4 weeks. Did it improve your thing? Let's do it again.
Yeah, that's a great question. So when you look at studies on powerlifters at a very high level, there's a huge correlation between like muscle thickness, cross-sectional area, lean body mass, and performance. So what that means is that when you have people who are technicians with their lifts, are already self-selected for all the genetic traits that would require them to be at that high level and have the movement proficiency of a world-class powerlifter, the thing that's different is who's got a bigger engine, and that can make or break whether or not you're really, really good. So the way I approach that is that all of my basic powerlifting approach that's the same for everybody is you've got specific skill practice of getting stronger on the big three, and then you have a hypertrophy program underneath that. So I don't have any powerlifters unless they have a movement injury restriction or an equipment restriction that aren't doing a horizontal row, a vertical pull, an overhead press, and typically some type of unilateral leg movement. And that's not there for injury prevention purposes, although it might play a role. It's primarily there because I want to make sure that they
So I just started it, and you said, for every powerlifter, I include blah, 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 blah. And you said, the reason I do that. So can you start on the reason I do that?
Yeah, so the reason I do that is not necessarily for injury prevention, although it may have some effect. But I keep all of those basic kind of movement patterns in there, and I load them with kind of your typical hypertrophy setup, because that's something every powerlifter needs. Like, every powerlifter is going to be expressing their strength through the movements and become a better and better technician. Will make those neurological adaptations that are so important. But I want to try to build the engine, and sometimes the best way to do that, point A to point B, is not, just doing strength work on the big three, but just kind of bolting that technique work and specific work on top of kind of the backbone of a hypertrophy program, which is where I start. And then on a per need basis, I will institute the specific assistance work. And I only do that when I see a problem, So it's very possible that a highly advanced powerlifter or just a really well-built powerlifter may almost never do, accessory work, or I should say assistance work, where they're doing, limited range of motion, accommodating resistance, variations, pauses, etc. Like an example would be Bryce Lewis. He is at a point in his career where previously we did a fair amount of that, but now we don't do very much at all. He will do grip work specifically, because that tends to be the limiting factor with how much he can pull. And then we will also do, anytime he's getting like pec irritation or kind of shoulder pec tie-in, maybe pec minor irritation, we'll just switch sessions kind of on the fly to being close grip bench, just because he can still get the volume in and not get pain, and that recovers. But it's very much dependent. For another example would be my wife, squat. So we end up doing a fair amount of accessory work related to trying to strengthen that squat pattern, because the squat's just a poor vehicle for her to get better at squatting, as much as it still needs to be in there, because that's the way and the end result. But we'll do some box work. We will do overhead squats, front squats, other variations, single leg work, all in an effort to increase like her stability, ability to keep position, and all that stuff. And that has been more successful than just kind of hammering our heads against the wall and just doing a ton of squats. So I see it as very much a specific solution to a specific problem that may not be a permanent addition to the program by any means.
So with Barb, how did you know to start that even? How did you not know that, like, hey, her shit's plateauing, or versus like, we should try something else?
Yeah, so that's a great question, is how do you implement it? And I think, so from the coach's perspective, you identify a problem. And that may come through the course depending on how quick you are to act. And there's benefits and there's downsides to either being too conservative and not changing anything until you're absolutely sure. Basically, it's a wasted time and the athlete being frustrated. And there's also downsides to being the coach who, as soon as there's a minor plateau, you jump in and change something, because then you don't really know the natural course of things. It's tough to separate what did what, depending on how many variables you're changing. So you kind of want to find that nice balance where you're pretty sure that you've reached a plateau and that the current approach you're taking is not the best way to solve it. It's not just kind of a natural downfall in strength. And then that's when you go, all right, here's the specific problem we've identified. I'm going to talk it over with my athlete and whoever I trust as a fellow coach or mentor. And then I'm going to institute the specific solution. And then in our next testing block, we're going to see, did it work? And we can't know for sure that was actually the solution, because who knows if it would have resolved itself. But if it had a logical reason and all of a sudden a plateau is broken once you instituted it in a reasonable amount of time, you can be pretty sure that was probably the game changer. And now you have that addition to your toolbox for that athlete. So it's a matter of identifying a problem, instituting a potential solution, and then testing it. And if it works, fantastic, you've solved the problem. If not, you go back to the drawing board and you try to either approach it with a different tool for the same problem, or maybe you go, okay, the problem that I identified wasn't the right problem. And that very much is kind of just a recurring process, and you just have to be paying attention and being willing to do observed trial and error.
Yeah. I don't know if I'm asking you or asking you to talk about it, like the markers of a plateau, because obviously, okay, shit didn't go up, but what if it's not going up in all of the lifts? Then maybe we're not eating enough, we're overworked or whatever. So is it like Barb's squat wasn't going up, but the rest of her lifts were, kind of thing?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
It was like her squat was plateaued for years, we're talking. And while I'm trying things, by the way, but her bench and her deadlift were progressing.
Okay.
So that was a pretty obvious indicator. But other times you're right. Like if everything's plateaued, that could be a sleep issue. It could be a motivation issue. That could be a nutritional issue. That could be just
be
your
getting more elite, though. Also,
That's right.
Closer to.
Yeah, you might just need to start looking at different time frames for progress. Exactly.
Okay.
Could be a global programming issue. Like we need to increase frequency and increase volume, or they're absolutely beat to shit. We need to decrease that stuff. But when when the solution is an assistance movement, that means the problem is a specific lift, and that means other things should be progressing.
Right.
That's a great point.
Okay. Brad, were you going to say something? I feel like I cut you off.
I was, but as usual, I can't remember what it was.
I hate when I do that.
As we talk, it'll probably come back to me.
Okay. Well, I think global things again would be that this isn't. I'm trying to think like how did this start? Okay, that maybe we look outward too much as to what we should be doing, right? It's like if we said at the beginning, or we did say at the beginning, like if you're a healthy athlete who is cosmetic, you can kind of do whatever the fuck you want, but you have to be consistent, obviously, in order to measure progress and make the gains with disease in the right places. But it doesn't really necessarily matter what those movements are as long as you can load them appropriately if you're a cosmetic athlete. And that if you're a power lifter, I think we've gone into depth on that. But
the one thing that we really didn't talk about with powerlifters, especially kind of more powerlifters that are like intermediate advanced, is I'm finding that I almost have to plan like year-long blocks of training sometimes to really, like Eric said, to get that to build a bigger motor, to where like for 4 months we don't even touch anything that's much below 4s and 5s, and we do a lot of upper rep work, and then we kind of cut that down as we get closer and closer and closer to the competition. And so I think that's one thing that I kind of want to address is when you talk about not only periodization in the short term, but like huge chunks of periodization where a 4-month block might be all 70% of 1RM with high rep ranges trying to build that motor, and then getting a little bit more specific and knocking that down in ladder blocks as you get closer and closer and closer to competition. Stuff that I didn't even really think about. Even like
do you really mean all their work is above like 4s and 5s? Like never singles, doubles, triples? Or do you mean like a bulk of it?
The bulk of it, okay. Yeah. And I guess I should probably more specifically say the competition lifts or the big 6, I guess you might say.
Yeah. But
really working a lot of volume to build that motor in order to get, the most horsepower, I guess you might say, as we start getting more specific and more specific and more specific towards the competition.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's like, the more advanced an athlete gets, the more you have to look at extended time frames to see a meaningful change, to know whether things are working or not. And I think that you bring up a good point, is that in those development periods where you're focusing more on the engine versus the skill, that is a great time to experiment with different accessory movements and different assistance lifts, and to see if that does something for you. But, like Andrea said, it does become, I think, a sliding bar of one increases while the other decreases. Like one thing I've been playing around with a lot is that when I have someone in a development block like that, or even an extended 4-month period like you're talking about, we'll still hit like, give me a single at a 7, to start it off, and then we'll do some back off work just to kind of keep that skill. And I think the interesting question is, how much do you need to keep that high end single repetition skill there while you build the back? Then on the flip side of that question is, when you're in your quote unquote intensity or peaking block, what is the upper end limit of getting a benefit from doing that heavy single work. Like I think it's probably far less than like daily 1RM training, for example. I think 3 times a week starting off with like a single at 8 to 10 RPE is probably a fair amount of the max stimulus you could probably get out of somebody. And then you're probably better served doing other things, So that's an interesting question, which I think is can give some insights into how much of your training should be accessory movements.
So personally, go ahead.
Well,
Sorry.
and I was just going to say, when it just came back to me what I was going to talk about when you said how much of that work do you need. It brings me back to our situation that we've got, where I can't do my competition pull due to an injury, but I can do a similar pull. I can't do a sumo deadlift, but I can do a snatch grip deadlift without any pain. Now, granted, the loads aren't nearly as heavy, but yet it still seems like that, probably in addition to the rest of my programming, is still gaining me progress in my competition pull, which is an exciting period because it's kind of a neat experiment, because I'm wondering when or if it's going to top out to where I'm no longer getting stronger in my competition pull from that variant, due to limitation. Or will it never top out? Will we just continue to progress? It's kind of an exciting time to kind of watch and see how that develops.
Yeah, and it's a cool situation because it's not something we would have tried normally. We were forced into the situation because you just simply can't deadlift without pain right now. Hopefully that will change, and it looks like it may be changing. But yeah, like the ultra specificity camp, and I mean like ultra, like make Zerdos look reasonable. I hope he's listening. But like the ultra specificity camp, their arguments fall apart when you start looking at some of the data. Like we recently reviewed something for mass where there was a group of people who were being tested on bench, but their training didn't include bench. They were doing like lateral raises, tricep pushdowns, and I don't even think they had a compound press in there. It was just a bunch of weird bodybuilder isolation stuff, and their bench press went up. So if hypertrophy had no influence on it at all, that really doesn't make any sense. Or maybe it's it could be muscular coordination, or just becoming more familiar with moving weights, or less neural inhibition. And I think it probably does come down to how well do you maintain skill? How quickly does your skill degrade? How often do you have to practice it? One thing I've seen working with athletes over time is that a natural athlete, you can show them a drill once or twice, and they'll go out and look like they've been doing it for months pretty quick. And the other ones who aren't quite natural athletes will need to work on it multiple practices just to do it right. And you would imagine they'd not only pick it up quickly, but they'd lose it slowly. And on the other side of it is how much inherent technical demand is there of the lift. And I would say the squat and the bench are more technically demanding than a deadlift. Sumo deadlift probably higher than a conventional, I would say, if I had to choose. So, but I still don't think they are as technically demanding as a bench press or as a squat. And most of the time when I hear someone say bench press isn't a technically demanding lift, they're not a very good bench presser.
Yeah. Well, to contrast everything I've been saying, like for the past 10 minutes, I do much, much better doing singles, doubles, triples at 85% or higher often. If I don't touch it for a long time, it feels way, way, way heavier.
That makes sense to me because of how mobile you are. You learning where your range of motion should be purposefully stopped and finished, how to stay tight in all the different positions. I see that being something that would need more practice, And I remember you've mentioned that before, and I thought that makes sense to me.
Yeah, my bench went on a multi-year stall until I programmed it. Like I would have the same percentages for the big three. Once I did same thing for squats and deads, but increased my daily bench percentage somewhere between like 7 and 10% across every single workout, I started finally having that go up. So I don't know if that's a lift specific thing, if that's whatever, but that's how weird it is. Or I don't think that's uncommon either for a female. Is that a female thing that we've talked about before, Eric, that it's more common either in females or for bench more so than the other two lifts? I can't remember. But I remember reporting that to you, and you're like, that makes sense because blah, blah, blah. Now I don't fucking remember why you said it made sense.
Well, I've had a similar experience. Like,
Your frequency on bench had to go super high, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
and I played with intensity too. Like, I had a kind of a landslide of bench progress. And, some of it could just be that I couldn't put as much energy into squatting and deadlifting with, my hips being the way they were and then post-surgery. But, I was stuck at anywhere between 305 and 315 for, like, I think I probably benched 305 in 2009 when Brad watched me compete. And then I think the most I'd ever benched after that was 325, but that was in 2010 when I was a 220. 100 kilos. And I didn't, when I was 100 kilos, then I looked like I was enjoying my food. Now, at 100 kilos, 7 years later, I look like a bodybuilder in the off season. And I think, so that 325 was basically just, I have a fat butt, so I'm doing a decline, and I have chest fat, so there's, a centimeter off of my range of motion at the hardest part. So I'm able to bench. That's just fat boy 305, basically. Now I actually did a touch and go bench of 165 kilograms, which I want to say is like 363. Is that right?
Hey,
Can anyone do
I'm on it right now.
165 kg?
165.
Well, 150 is
363.7.
7. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a huge increase in strength that happened in like a year and a half. And the biggest change was, I upped my frequency. And I also, when I go into an intensity block, I start the day with the single between 8 to 10. And I kind of wave load that up. So that has made, both of those have made huge differences. I've also played around with some of that heavy eccentric work that I talked about earlier. And I would say each one of those has independently contributed towards me getting my bench press up, going from 2 to at least 4 times a week. Bench. And then when I'm training heavy, I do a lot per week, and then I do typically. So, yeah. That's one case where specificity worked really well for me. But on the flip side, I had to work around my squat, and while it was cool that I could maintain my squat between, basically like 485 to 495 for multiple years since 2013 when my hip first got diagnosed, I haven't been able to improve it. And I've been very creative. I've done like basically the same stuff that has worked for Brad's deadlift has not worked for my squat. Like Brad's doing hip thrusts, he's doing back extensions, he's doing rows, pull downs, and then he's doing a snatch grip deadlift as his main thing. And his sumo deadlift, he just hit a PR at his last meet. For me, I was doing like even more specific stuff than that, like front squat, box squat, just exactly the same, just a partial range, leg extension, leg curl, hip thrust, like single leg movements, and my squat stayed exactly the same the whole time. Even with me squatting for 2 to 3 sessions or even 2 to 3 weeks early on prior to the meet, I couldn't get it over that range. So, but now, interestingly enough, I haven't done it yet, but at the end of this training cycle, I'll probably high bar squat 200 kilos, which is like 440 pounds, which will be a high bar PR for me. I think the most I've ever high bar squatted was 435.
Yeah.
So.
Cool.
So yeah. So apparently, for my squat and my bench at least, I need a lot more specific work.
Yeah. How would we wrap this conversation?
Well, we could do some take-home points.
Okay. Eric, take me home.
I'm going to take you home. Take-home points are, 1, train the range of motion you have, especially if you're not a competitor in a sport that has required ranges of motion.
Okay.
Work on range of motion in terms of actually just straight up stretching or dynamic work. So train the range of motion you have. If you're in a sport that has a required range of motion and required movements to do in competition, you should always be training those movements to some degree. When you're using assistance movements to support those specific competition lifts, they should probably be more of a part of your program further from comp and less of a part of your program closer to comp. Oh. And when you institute them, they should be to solve specific problems, not just variety for variety's sake. Variety for psychological sake, sure. Variety to break up the monotony of training to some degree, sure. But most of your variety, quote unquote, should come through manipulating repetition ranges, volume, intensity, frequency, etc., as appropriate for where you are in your training program and your personal development. But the use of additional movements should be certainly for psychological reasons and to attempt to solve specific problems, and you can play with them more when you're further from comp.
Hey everybody, it's Eric Helms. Thanks for tuning into our podcast. As you know, at 3DMJ we promote evidence-based approaches to the lifting community. If that's something you want to dive deeper into, I'd encourage you to check out my research review, Monthly Applications in Strength Sport, or for short, MASS. This is a review that myself, Dr. Mike Zerdos, and Greg Knuckles put out every month. We cover the latest research publications that are applicable to strength and physique athletes, or anyone who's looking to get stronger or improve their body comp. Our content is in both written and video format. For more information on how to subscribe, check out 3dmusclejourney.com/mass. That's 3dmusclejourney.com/MASS for further details. Thanks for tuning in.